You are listening to the Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders, for coders, about all aspects of creating your best life as a developer.
I'm Will, the accomplished developer and aspiring software architect.
And I'm Beej, the advancing journeyman developer.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Complete Developer Podcast.
Stop writing them cruddy apps. We'll start talking about the most common apps we write as developers, CRUD, or Create, Read, Update, Delete, and why these are so prevalent. Then we'll list off some of the problems with CRUD along with potential solutions to these problems. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
Well, we went through DevSpace, and there was a lot of stuff there. Started on V2 of the product I'm working on late last week. And I'm scrambling around, trying to get one feature out the door before I go and have surgery Wednesday. I've got an inguinal hernia that is putting me in a lot of pain. And as a result, I have to go get it repaired. And I've had this surgery before on the other side, and it was painful then. It was about a week of not walking around much, no driving. I'm hoping that advances in laparoscopic surgery will make this easier this time around, because I don't think they even had that really last time.
Yeah, I'm thinking that was over 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's like they practically, go after your lower abdomen with a bandsaw or something. And now it's, a smaller bandsaw, I guess. But anyway, that's coming up. And so I'm just trying to get things stable at work. Tomorrow I have to come up with a, kind of an action plan for the junior and mid-level, .NET developers to make sure they've got everything they need. And then I'll be off for a bit while I'm recuperating. I don't know how long it'll take. So yeah, that's my week coming up. I'm not overly looking forward to it, but I'm looking forward to eventually not having pain. When I did the talk at DevSpace, I talked for an hour, and then I had to sit for an hour and a half, I think, after that, because I couldn't walk around. And
we had I took a chair up there for you just in case you needed to sit down, but you were able to stand the whole time, so that was good.
Yeah, I broke out in a cold sweat from pain while I was up there, but I was able to stand stupidly. So how about you?
Well, I am not a robot. I got that silver badge for Stack Overflow while we were at DevSpace. To get that badge, you have to meet a staff member in person and apply it to your Stack Overflow account while the conference is going on. Like, you can't get that after. If they give you the badge, it ends at the conference end.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. That and quite a few other things that we did. It was a really cool, interesting conference. On Friday, we went out to dinner with the creators of the game Pixel, RU Squared. They were there representing Red Hat. It was really cool talking to them and then some of the other speakers that came out with us. But now that your talk is out of the way, I'm preparing for my talk at Bar Camp this Saturday. I'll be talking about the developer's role in Scrum. It's a presentation that I've given at work, so I already have kind of the basis for the slideshow, though I'm going to adjust it to be a bit more like the way that your slideshow was, how you had the main point and then sub-slides.
Yeah.
Instead of the way I did it at work, which was one slide with everything. While we were at DevSpace, we kind of joked about having a beer or a shot before your talk, especially for you to kind of relax. And we do drink beer when we record and stuff. So I've got something I think is a little bit controversial for IoTs related to that. So let's go ahead and roll the music. Like I said, this is, I think, a little controversial. It's a project called IoT Alcohol and Health Monitoring System. Now, this would be an interesting project if it were designed for home or personal use, but the description talks about using this to determine if employees are under the influence of alcohol or, quote, under bad health conditions.
What does that mean?
Exactly. Now, while you shouldn't be drinking on the job, there's a lot of ethical problems with this concept. First off, for the quote, bad health conditions, like Will said, what does that even mean? All the thing does is monitor your blood pressure. And that's literally a snapshot of what it is at that time. So you could have just been running and your blood pressure is going to be up. You sit still for 10 or 15 minutes and it's going to go down.
Or you just had some hot sauce.
Yeah. So it could be a lot of different things. And it seems to me like this was created by someone that doesn't really understand medicine, quite possibly.
Yeah, or medical stats.
Yeah.
Just in general.
You can get a fair amount of information from blood pressure. But my other question is, who's monitoring this? Is it a licensed physician that's determining a person is unhealthy or too unhealthy to work? There's just a lot of poor assumptions and implications here. And as far as the alcohol monitoring, all it says is alcohol sensor, which is not really specific. Are we talking a breathalyzer? What type of alcohol sensor are they talking about here?
You got to pee on the machine, obviously.
Well, that really wouldn't measure your alcohol content.
No, but it would be satisfying.
That's true. So the reason I'm talking about this is because it's something I know a little bit about, the whole med school thing. And I want you guys to know that not all of the IoT projects out there are great or even a good idea. We could have a much longer discussion on the idea of doing something because you can versus if you should do it.
Yeah, and I guess this would probably be a pretty interesting project for somebody learning.
Yeah.
Because you think about it, like you and I could do this, right? We could set this thing up and then we could drink a few beers and we could actually test the sensor accuracy and do all that. Like as an educational project, that's fine.
Yeah,
as a policy project, not so hot.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was talking about at the beginning. This would be a really interesting project if it was designed for personal use, but everything in it talked about for work environments. The whole concept just made me feel creepy reading about it.
Yeah.
So just understand that not all projects are a good idea.
Yeah. Remember Jurassic Park.
Right.
Right. That movie had a lot of valuable life lessons for technologists.
So who's talking to us this week?
Well, I got a personal Facebook message from Eric Wright, and we, of course, edited to remove some personal information he might not want public. But he said, listening to the podcast, LOL, I first thought kernel bug too. And this was, I guess, this past week's episode.
Yeah.
And I forget what I said. It's a major bug, and then I made a crack about it, being upgraded to a kernel bug or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was. I've been on a dad joke kick. I'm sorry.
It was something about a major bug that got promoted to kernel.
Yeah. So anyway, he continues with, I hate that I haven't been able to come to Code Jam since my awesome first Code Jam. I lost my job and immediately found a new job in IT as a PC LAN analyst for a shop in Kentucky and work Saturdays now. I've been able to use my knowledge of JavaScript to fix a bug in one of our applications. He goes on to give some details that we won't share publicly. Because of my initiative and faith in myself gained from the Code Jam and from listening to the podcast, I was able to save the team time with debugging because I was able to tell them the exact issue from the debugging I did myself. I was given special recognition and invited to visit our corporate offices this coming summer. Thought I would share that with you guys. You and BJ are awesome.
Eric also goes on to ask about some other members of the group, and we'll get you in touch with them. If you want, you can join our Complete Developer Slack channel at slack.completedevelopernetwork.com. We have several members there. Guys, you guys can join too. We have conversations about development. Junior Developer Toolbox crew is in there, and we're usually on a few hours of every day. So.
Yeah, it varies, obviously, because we work too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're usually somewhat available. So if if we're taking a break or something like that, we can kind of answer short questions and have conversations. And of course, a lot of times later in the evening, we're on a lot more.
Eric, we're really excited to read that you're having such success in your new job. A great way to take the initiative there and get an awesome win for you and for your company. Send us an email with your contact information and we'll send you a water bottle. And guys, if you'd like a Complete Developer water bottle, leave us a review in iTunes or comment on the website or any of our social media. We post all our episodes to Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Google+. We're also on Path and Tumblr. Also, check us out on Facebook and Twitter Live every Monday evening. We talk about what's going on in the tech world and answer some listener questions as well. What is CRUD and why is it so popular?
It stands for Create, Read, Update, Delete. These are the major operations that you'll see in a database application. You create a record, you read the record, you update the record, and you delete the record.
Yeah, the CRUD functions are basically user interfaces to a database. CRUD manipulates entities in the database.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is we say entities are objects, but like a database object is not a programming object. And it's not a programming entity. Database tables, for instance, in SQL are listed under sys objects. So
yeah. So it's there's an issue of using the same words to mean different things in that particular environment.
Yeah, and basically what's happening with CRUD is this is the database equivalent of like HTTP verbs. There's get, post, put, delete. I had to think about that for a minute for some reason.
Even though it's written.
I know, even though it's written right there. I just yeah.
There's a few other ways of looking at this. One that I read about was called BREAD, or browse, read, edit, add, delete.
So browse would be like get a list?
Yeah. It's basically a special variant of read to fit modern web applications. I've heard people like this term better because it sounds warmer and nicer than CRUD. But guys, let's be honest, CRUD apps are cruddy to write. And once you've built a few, you realize that they're pretty much all the same.
Yeah.
Some of the problems that you see with CRUD apps are similar to the issues we've discussed in object relational mappers, because this is the pattern used by ORMs. We've created a list of 7 problems that you'll find when creating or working in CRUD apps. And for each one, we're going to talk about the problem and then list some of the potential solutions for that problem.
So the first problem with CRUD apps is that they're boring.
They're typically repetitive, as once you've solved the CRUD app, you're doing it over and over for all the data stored.
Yeah, and this isn't just a prima donna thing, right? People go, oh, well, developers, they don't want to be bored. It's the fact that you're doing the same thing over and over again, and you get kind of lulled to sleep, and you miss stuff because you're doing the same thing repetitively. You make mistakes, or it decreases your satisfaction as an employee.
Right.
It also decreases the amount of stuff you're learning because you're not doing anything new and different.
Now, this is why ORMs and other automation tools are used. Automation tools have their own issues. Apps are different and have different uses and flows, and the tools can add complexity by trying to be omnipurposed.
Yeah, here's the stuff off the table, put it on the screen, make it where you can edit it, make it where you can put it back to the database. Mm-hmm. This is the kind of app we're talking about. But what you end up with a lot of these tools is that because people have special requirements, hey, they want to do something after a record of this type is saved. Oh, so we'll add a post-commit hook. Oh, wait, it'd be great if we could do something before the record's saved. So let's add a pre-commit hook. Hey, what happens if we're selecting a set of them? We should probably have something there too. Oh, wait, we need audit trails. We need logging. And it ends up blowing up into this huge thing that's very complex. And so your choices here end up being between get the really complex over-the-top thing that you have to configure the crap out of, or write repetitive boilerplate code for all kinds of things.
For more specifics on automating writing to the database, check out our episode, Why Your DBA Hates Your ORM. And it goes into a lot of details about the problems with ORM specifically.
Yeah, and I think that would be a really great speech title.
I wonder why.
I don't know. Like, somebody should speak about that, say in Huntsville.
Yeah, maybe like last weekend.
Yeah. Because it should have already happened.
Yes. Now, there's not really an easy solution to boredom, especially when the tasks need to get done. And we've talked about automation tools, but they can help. But you want to find one that allows some customization, especially ones that allow you to have most things turned off by default and then come in and turn them on as you need them.
Right.
Another thing you can do is to try to batch building CRUD pieces of the application.
Yeah, and this is what Rails did when it first came out, right? Is you would do Rails new, and then I'm trying to remember the exact command line, but it was basically like, hey, here's my table, make me a UI for it that does the CRUD.
Yes.
And then I can alter that from there, but it gets the boilerplate, a lot of that stuff out of the way. And people were pretty productive with that for a good long while.
And Entity Framework does some of that too in the .NET world.
Yeah, and Dynamic Data Entities did that. Of course, they did a lot less extensible model.
And with some other tools, you can do that quasi-effectively within Hibernate. you still have to do a little bit of writing yourself, especially if you're using a view model.
Yeah, those tools help. Like they're probably like a 40 to 50% solution.
Right. Another is to use the don't repeat yourself or dry principle as much as possible. Try to write code once.
Yeah, to be fairly generic. So you make, this is where a lot of people start doing things, this is like my least favorite pattern ever, but I understand why it happens, where they put a repository over a unit of work pattern, for basically doing CRUD.
Can you give us a deeper explanation of what a unit of work pattern is?
Sure. That's where it's like you open up the database, you say, okay, I have this context that has all my stuff on it. I'm going to pull objects back, and then I'm going to change those objects, add objects, delete objects. And then when I save, my set of changes all gets committed in one shot. But it's object-based, not transaction-based at the database level. So it's still wrapped in an implicit transaction or even an explicit one. But the crux of it is that I'm altering objects, and then their representation on disk gets changed at the end of the operation.
In comparison to that, what is a repository pattern?
Typically, the way I've seen that used, and it's not always, because this is not technically the textbook definition of a repository, it's the way people misuse it, but where somebody says, hey, I've got this one table, let me cluster all the operations for that particular type in a class. So like if I have customers, I would have a method that's, get customers. Find customer by name, get customer by ID, delete customer, that kind of stuff. They put it all in one interface and they do the things, for that operation. And what will happen when you have a repository over a unit of work so that you're not having to pass that unit of work around, what people will do is they'll say, I'll just create a new unit of work for this one task. And then what does the programmer consuming that do? They say, okay, I already have something that does this. So let me build up what I'm actually trying to do, like a quasi-real unit of work that's not in the unit of work pattern. Instead, it's a bunch of units of work that can fail independently.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, and it just creates a lot of extra transactions. It kills caching. It does a lot of bad things. That's why I hate this pattern. But it happens in CRUD apps a lot because somebody says, hey, I can make an iRepository of this type. And this is talking .NET, obviously, but a lot of your other languages have some ability to do something like this. They create a generic repository class, and then they implement, methods essentially in there for all these things. And then they can make a generic UI that hits that repository, and it works at the individual table level. But the instant your object model gets past that, you have a bad time.
Okay, that makes sense. The other thing you can do, and we've kind of hinted at this a little bit, is to create templates or boilerplate code wherever possible. Now, this may be a little controversial because I know some people are very anti-boilerplate.
Yeah, and they're anti-code generation, which is why they all code in assembler. Is because they're anti-code generation. See, that's the thing. It's like people are not anti-code generation. There is nobody that is a software developer that is against code generation. They're against obvious code generation. Those are two very different things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In other words, code generation they have to interact with, because there's code generation. Literally, that's a step of compilation and building and all that. Like they call one part of that code generation. So it's not code generation that's the issue. That said, code generation tends to be people's golden hammer. So if they start generating code, they're like, oh, I can make it do this, this broad swath of the work, right? Cool. It does the broad swath of the work. But then there's this 5% thing over here, because like it did maybe 80%. There's 5% of it that I think probably could be code generated with a little bit more work. And then the next 5% is bigger than the rest of the thing, but they still do it. And so eventually you end up writing almost like your own, you spend more time writing the code generator than you would writing the code that it generates. And so you lose the time savings. Like you got to remember the Pareto rule.
I was going to say, it sounds like that 80-20 principle. If you can spend 20% of your time writing a code generator that will generate 80% of the code that you need.
Yeah, then you're ahead.
Yeah. But if you spend 80% of your time trying to get the rest of that 20% of the code generated, you might as well have just written the code because you could have done it faster.
Yeah, and with fewer bugs.
Right. So the next one is that CRUD tends to have direct table access. The problem here is that this restricts what other people using the database can do, which makes other people want to restrict what you can do.
It can also have some interesting security implications. things like, okay, we pulled a, entire customer object back, but we only showed like 6 fields of it. And there's one field called is admin. Mm-hmm. Well, if they manage to craft a post and you're not careful that has that flag set, it'll now get written to the database. You updated that record in the table when your view, your projection of that object didn't have that in it. But because of the way that you architected it going back in, it can happen. This is called a mass assignment vulnerability. And there's stuff like that. But the big thing here is that you don't own your database. Like your app may be the only app using that database unless it's a microservice and it truly, truly owns the database, which is not how most people's stuff is, even though it maybe should be. If you're not the only thing touching that database, then that database is now is something you have to insulate yourself against. And direct table access makes that where you can't do that anymore. Like if you put abstractions in the database, which is how we suggest fixing this, then it's possible for the DBA to fix it, or it's possible for you to fix it without changing your compiled app.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Because if nothing else, let's say that you're an app developer, you got a DBA, and there's some other app developers on the other side. Something changes. Okay, if it's in your app, guess who has to fix it? You do. If it's in the database and you know something about databases, you could fix it, or the DBA could fix it, or the other app guys could fix it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because that's probably something that's shared across teams is understanding of SQL.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is that changes to the database require changes to your view. So again, like going with the customer example, let's say that, okay, here's one that's come up a lot recently. You have a radio button list that has male and female as genders, right? Mm-hmm. And previously you were storing a bit. This is, that either you could say bit is female or the bit, set is male.
Right.
Right. Like, and that's how you're viewing that data. Somebody changes that field and says, hey, we've got this other table over here, which is happening, across a lot of people's databases right now is, similar things, or changing it from just 2 different characters that it could be to a whole set. Now you've got to update your UI. Now we can argue all day long about whether that, you need to update the UI or not. But the problem is when it happens, because when they change that table in production, you have to update or your stuff is broken. Versus going, okay, we can leave this up for another day and we can fix our stuff and deploy on a timeline that's a little bit easier and doesn't nail the team. Remember that you don't want to lose optionality for yourself.
Also, since DBAs are a lot of times under a completely different chain of command, like where I work, the DBAs are under operations, not development.
Yeah, where I work, the DBAs are, they don't exist.
But that can also make the way that you implement your code subject to results of corporate infighting, differences between middle management, or departmental differences. It can cause a lot of problems. And this is a situation that development rarely wins. Because,
the thing is, if we were actually good at negotiating things and pushing, there's a lot of stuff that wouldn't be messed up in the development world. But we don't. On average, that's not what happens in the industry. So you have to insulate yourself.
The solution to this is to make specific database abstractions per task so that you only have to change the ones that you actually need to change.
Right. So for instance, in the customer example where you have the gender thing in there, if you have a view that's coming off of that table, you can shape data, accordingly. Now, it may be a thing where you have to slightly change because that example, now there's a new item added to the set. But in other cases, it might not. So you can sort of insulate yourself and you can make it so that someone else can fix the problem without you having to recompile your app.
Exactly.
And redeploy.
No. The next one is the model of CRUD doesn't accurately reflect reality. And the problem here is you don't update your personal record, you move, you get married. All sorts of other things happen. You have a kid.
Yeah.
You get divorced. You don't go and update a record. I didn't
check a box that says has beard. I just didn't shave.
Right.
And this is something that developers seem to do a lot of is when you have a model of reality that's based on the way the machine works, what ends up happening is you push that model onto the world instead of it going the other way. And so it's a pretty insidious thing because you end up in a situation where, first of all, the way that you have to express things doesn't match reality and you can't make it match reality. It's like not having like a word for something. Like, for instance, I'm sure there's some tribe somewhere that doesn't have a word for, I don't know, music. They don't have that. I kind of doubt that. But let's say that there was some hypothetical tribe that didn't have a word for music. Okay, selling these people symphony tickets is going to be hard.
Yes.
Because they don't have a word for it. And you can easily get yourself into that situation because you're using limited metaphors for what's actually going on. And so you're having to bend those to shape it towards the world versus letting the world push in.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. And this can really burn you as well, because what will end up happening is you go, oh, like, let's say that, we have a user and we say we want a primary email address and a secondary email address, right? Okay, cool. What happens when a user wants a third one? Right? The database will allow it. Like, our verbiage for that will tend to be, master detail table, not here's their two pieces. So it bends reality, or the expression of reality, in a way that's not useful from a design perspective. You can box yourself in. This is kind of hard to explain, but when you've hit that wall, you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, no, it makes sense, because a lot of what I do is taking older systems and rebuilding them into more modern systems, and we're trying to automate things and put a lot of forms that have had to be filled out by hand online so that people can fill them out. Well, a great example is one of the forms that people have to fill out. It is multi-purpose, and you select, all right, this is why I'm sending this in. So you may already have a permit and you need to make an alteration on that, or you may need to add someone to it or something like that. And so you send in the same form that you send in for a new one, just with just the changes on it.
So like the LLC form.
Right.
That I had to file every year. It's like, oh, I'm creating a new LLC. Oh, I'm editing the address. Oh, I'm changing the owners. And it's all on that one form.
Yeah. And the idea was so that, at least from a legislative point of view and from, a government point of view, they only had to have one form,
right,
to get approved, and, one form to track and things like that. But when it starts applying to, it's filling it out online, they don't need to fill out all that information to change one field in the database.
Right. And I mean, think about how validation works there too.
Yeah.
How complicated that gets with a multi-purpose form like that. You got to say, well, if this checkbox is checked, these 5 things are required. But if this one's checked and this radio button is on this setting, then, these other 2 things are required. And this one thing we were required before, I don't require that. You end up in that real fast.
And we're there in another app. It's an inspection app. I got to go out on one of those inspections, and it's a stack of forms. That it's, if they have this, then we fill out these forms. If it's this, we have these forms. If it's these forms. And that is all in one mobile application.
Yeah, and that sounds horrendous.
So the solution to this is to express things in terms of entities and operations on those entities. And then figure out how to project those into a data store and retrieve them. Basically, the idea here is to use the model of reality of the world around you and push that into the database. Don't try to force the data structure, the database model onto the world, because that's not going to work. The world is a lot bigger than your database, no matter what big data says. But you want to model your data after what is in the world around you. Now, you can make some adjustments. It's just like the map is not the path. You're modeling the world, but you need to model the world and not try to force the world into that model.
Yeah, because the other thing too is if you start your model at what reality is, and then go towards the database with it, if there are edge cases, you're more likely not to have as many problems with those, just as a rule. Because like if it's stuff that's not known, it'll still be reflected in the way the world works.
Right. So the next one is entities in your app are constrained to what the database will understand, not what your language or even the business rules can express.
Yeah, and this can really hurt you because it makes the design decisions that you're making look really illogical to shareholders. So, for instance, they go, well, a person has an address. What do you mean there's multiple addresses for a person. Well, of course, there are, but they have a primary, right? And so the business owner's like, why can't you just store address 1, address 2, address 3 in here? Because if you're going from the database centric model out, you're also going to apply like third normal form or something along those lines, and you're going to structure things in a way that doesn't really look right to the business people, and it makes them question your logic, and that's not a place you want to be in.
Things like inheritance, polymorphic relationships, and hierarchical relationships are harder to represent in a relational database. So much so that developers designing that way will avoid using them when it makes sense to try and avoid the headache.
Yeah, and this is almost a moral hazard type thing, right? Like if you're starting with that, you're giving the developers opportunity to try to cut out work in the future that's painful.
Mm-hmm.
But what you end up doing is you end up expressing things in terms that the business people and stakeholders don't understand.
And that makes sense because we had this kind of debate just today at work about a certain transaction and the consequences of it being wrong. And because we're going from a paper form that people submit to this is online, you can fill it out yourself and make a payment.
Right.
And if they mess something up, the consequences of that and things like that. And it had to be pointed out, look, this is the cost of doing online business, is that if things get messed up, yes, it's going to have to go through a process to refund them, unless you want your employees looking over their application before they make a payment and have a process for that. And it was like, well, the point is they have to make the payment before it gets viewed. It was this whole back and forth. It was like that is the risk of doing business online, is that somebody might overpay or underpay and they have to get a refund or have to be told you need to pay more.
And I'll give an example of a situation that happened to me. The app I work on at work, we have an editor, and basically, there's like a backer that's on it, and then you've got editable content areas. So it's like for billing and stuff. And so you can have an editable area in there that has specific verbiage that the user can edit. And you can also change that verbiage based on conditions. So you can say, okay, if they're from Tennessee, put this verbiage in. If they're from Kentucky, put this verbiage in, right? But in the UI, the area is already available. It's locked in. But the way that the database was designed, you have a thing that represents the text that's in there. And under that was the conditional. And it should have been the other way around, but because the way it was designed, it came out backward. And so you end up with a situation where it's like, I have to, when they go in to edit and they say, okay, I'm adding a condition, I have to create the parent record first. And you get a lot of weird, illogical behavior because they're like, why is there a stub record here? When, I created that conditional, but then I didn't save it and I canceled out. Well, now there's a stub. And so you spend a lot of effort just hacking around that. And that's because of the way the database was structured. And you can kind of run into the same sort of thing, not even with a bad database design, but because you can't represent it well in a database at the level that you're looking at it when you're first designing it.
So the solution to this is to build the object model and store it to a document database or some other non-relational store. Then figure out your underlying data model later.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people do this. You start with a UI design and go, okay, what do I have to show? And how's that going to be shown? What shape do I need the data in? Especially like with the web. How do I need the data shape to represent this UI? Okay, now that's the payload that's coming across the wire. Now how do I, construct this object server side? And then the last thing they do is they build the tables that store it.
That's the way our former UI lead talked about it. He got promoted. But that's the way that a lot of the modeling for the newer apps, because it was the front end that was pushing this new model of doing Angular and .NET APIs. And so that's the way a lot of things are designed, because it was the front end guys are like, we want to bring in this newer technology to do these views, to do these really cool things. And so they designed that way in mind. But then you have the database people that have been there for decades that are going, all right, but we also have to integrate with the old databases and make, transfer the data from them to the new system and things like that. And so you get me as an API developer caught between and pulled in both directions.
Yeah, and the front end guys are actually, their approach is probably the better one, because what is closer to the real world? The abstract data model that's based on storage constraints, or the UI model that's based on how a human being interacts with the system?
And I like to think that I've done a good job of helping to mitigate and balance that. Seems like that's what a lot of the API does, is to mitigate that. There's been a lot of times where the API developer said, all right, well, I'll have to spend some time figuring out how to do that. I'm like, I know how to do that on the API. It's a business logic thing. I know how to do that on the API. We should just do it there, and I can create an endpoint that you call and get the information back.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, well, that makes life easier. Yes. Because he's thinking in terms of the front end. And that makes sense from his perspective. And then we get together and talk about it, and he's like, oh, there's a way to do that. And then when I was working with Cody, he would come to me and say, hey, can we do this on the back end, or would it be better to do it on the front end? And we'd have that. Now I've gotten the other developer that I work with to start doing that, where he'll say, hey, which is more difficult, you creating this functionality or me creating it? Who needs to figure out how to do this? And so it's kind of cool. We have a great relationship on the way we interact in that aspect.
The next problem is that CRUD approaches mess up your development timelines. And so here's kind of what this looks like. You initially start out and you have a data model that you built, during a specification phase, and then you stand up some screens real quick. And it only takes a few minutes. You get going. You're able to show them to management. They ooh and ah because now they can actually see the thing. And then they want something else. They want some small tweak to it. They want a screen that's more complex. Now your timeline is at risk. And the reason this is at risk is because they saw you do something that looks complex to them. Bear in mind that they don't know how complex any of this stuff is. And so what do they end up doing? Well, they go, okay, you should be able to build this other form in a few minutes too, because you built these easy ones. They don't have a way of determining how complex something is as a developer, because they would be a developer.
That's like the idea of, let me mock up a data structure for you with Access, and they go, oh, that's great, let's use it.
Yes. Right, because that's one of the dangers of the way of prototyping with live code. And this is why if you ever see me prototype something, what do? I get pencil or balsamic or something like that, and I make the sketchy layout, right? That's, the buttons that are kind of slightly off of square and all this stuff that looks like somebody drew them by hand, to make it very obvious that this isn't the real thing.
Yeah. And there's sketching it, and then there's being a designer and creating designs.
Yeah.
And those are two different things, because we do have a designer that creates designs and then passes those images to the front end team to build.
Yeah, one thing's a specification for the front end team, but another thing is something you're showing stakeholders.
Right. And you remember my big lesson in this.
Oh Lord, that was fun.
It was the first project I had ever written specs for. It was my first solo project when I was working with you, and I did that. I went all out on it wasn't a design spec, it was just my wireframe had colors and images in it.
Yep.
And should not have, because that caused no end of trouble. And it was with a friend of ours, which doesn't even get into the complexity of if it was for a client that is not someone you know personally and can work with and talk to, but someone you meet with once a week or something.
Yeah, and to some degree, I kind of let that happen to you, although a lot of it was you had it done before I noticed. But, I saw that one coming, and I was like, well, he's going to learn this either way, and this is not a real bad time to learn it. But you can do the same thing here, is you create a set of expectations for what the client, what they think that they're going to get out of you and the amount of time they're going to get it, and then you have to live up to that. And you can't, because you automated the simplest parts. So the solution is you can still do CRUD, but you have to communicate very well that approach only works for simple scenarios. And I'll tell you something else. Your CRUD generator probably lets you bend the rules a little bit. In other words, you can do slightly more complex scenarios than the basic one. Don't tell them.
Right.
It's easier to argue over a binary thing, black versus white versus shades of gray, because somebody will go, oh, can't you make the gray just a little darker? Like it's easier to say, look, this can't be bent beyond take the table, make a UI screen. Even if you can add post-save hooks and if you can do all these other things. Like, don't break all that stuff down because they're going to start asking for that. That's not how you build an app because you're going to hit the wall soon. Be strategic on this. Don't screw up there because I've done that and it sucks.
Yeah, I can believe that. I've been asked to do things that were a bit beyond CRUD for some of our apps, and I got them done, and it needed to be done. It was something that had to be done. I was still early enough on in my career that I didn't know there were other ways of doing things.
Yeah. And if you build out a CRUD form and you build, it's the basic CRUD form, every little tweak is just a little bit more expensive and it eventually piles up and you can't deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing to worry about is think about the political implications of what you're doing because you can very quickly paint yourself into a corner and they will not be sympathetic.
Exactly. Finally, CRUD approaches mess up your own estimates after the fact. So we've talked about messing up development timelines sort of before and when they're going on, but they can also mess you up afterwards as well. And the problem here is a year after a CRUD app is put into production, a change request comes in. Your developer makes an estimate on fixing it based upon reasonable assumptions about the app. CRUD can confound this.
Yeah, and a big example of this is where, okay, you've got a form and it looks normal and you're saving, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you've got, pre and post commit hooks. You've got audit trailing. You've got all these other things that are tightly entwined with that because they're having to work around the CRUD model. Right. And you want to, say, add a column. Well, what would you normally do? Oh, it's a CRUD form. It looks like a CRUD form. Therefore, I'll add the column and regenerate. Now, your post commit hook is gone. Your audit trail is gone. Your pre commit hook is gone. Your special validation that you hand coded JavaScript code for is gone. So you've got to do a get revert and go back to it, and you've got to recode it. So now instead of a regen process that took a couple of minutes, you might be in for a day, depending on how nasty it is. And so this can really blow estimates out of the water, and you don't see it coming unless you specifically know what might have happened.
Exactly. I mean, of course, I always try to make my estimates after I've looked at the code.
Yeah, and I do too, but there's a lot of the kind of shops that are going to push you to do like generated CRUD stuff tend to have like fast moving expectations that they don't give you time to actually give a real estimate. And so it's just like it exacerbates the problem. And then their reaction to exacerbating the problem is to exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, I can kind of see that. But I mean, I guess that's one of the benefits of where I work. We had this happen not too long ago where we pushed an application to production, and then a few days later, they were having issues that we never saw in testing or UAT or anything. So even when the business team was in user testing, they didn't see it. It was only when they put it out into production.
Yeah. But, the thing is like if you have a CRUD app and it's been sitting out there a while, people request changes. They request a lot of changes over time. And what will end up happening is the front end still looks the same, but instead of it being this clean generated code, you have like this raft of hacks behind it.
Oh, yeah.
And so anytime something has to change, it has to survive getting through those raft of hacks. Like I'm dealing with this at work right now. The guy had a very CRUD-centric approach to web applications. And, as a result, he even did the thing of like, okay, here's a page, and this page is for this type. And it saves them, it updates them, it deletes them. And it's a web forms page. So it's like holding stuff in view state and session state and going back and forth. And so if you're trying to trace through the app, it's horrendous to do that versus, hey, here's a discrete operation on a chunk of data.
I use a repository pattern. I use controllers.
So you use a repository over in Hibernate?
Yeah.
Of course, you're probably like actually loading, like you're not doing entity based repository. So like you're saying, okay, here's a customer with all their stuff, and I'm calling it, not here's a customer like header record versus like you're getting the aggregate root and all the stuff under it,
right?
And dealing with that versus here's the header record, here's the detail. Yeah.
It all comes in one package.
That's what a repository is supposed to be.
Yes.
But the typical way that repositories seem to get used, at least in the apps I encounter, of course, I tend to kind of clean up a lot of stuff. So maybe that's why I've kind of made a career out of it. It's like their understanding of it is very database centric. And so the way you fix this is you either use CRUD completely and understand that your app can't do anything else, or you don't. More than likely, you can't get away with CRUD in this scenario.
You can use CRUD in parts of your app.
Yeah.
But not all of it. It's not you either have a CRUD app or you don't.
Yeah.
You can have CRUD pieces to an app.
Yeah, and that's perfectly valid. Lookup tables.
Yes.
Like, you don't want to code a UI and go, oh, here is a list of states in the union. Okay, I mean, like, you may have some little deal to, like, edit and add ones because, hey, Puerto Rico might become a state next year. Mm-hmm. And you got to support that one guy that's got to make that entry one time.
Yeah.
But there's other reasons you might have something similar, but what you don't want to go, okay, I want to have, atomic discrete operations around this. Like, no, your create, read, update, delete, that's fine there. Mm-hmm. But when it goes to the level of, okay, you have a complex aggregate structure of, it's an order and it's got order details and line items and taxes and all this other crap that goes on it, that you don't want to do as a CRUD thing because that's not how the real world works. So I would say use CRUD or don't at the form level. Mm-hmm. Don't try to use CRUD and bend it into something it doesn't do. And the problem is when you do that, the problem is when you use it and it works for a little bit and then something changes, it's very politically difficult to go, hey, we have to rewrite this. People hate hearing that you have to rewrite it because they think, well, you could just make this one change. It's like, you could. But next time I have to make a change, you're also going to make me make that change. And the time after that. And eventually, rewriting it is going to be so difficult because it's no longer CRUD. It's difficult to work with, and it would be difficult to replace versus shifting over and going ahead and taking the hit. So on the whole CRUD thing, there's a reason early on that I didn't tell you why this was as bad. And part of it is because it's just too much stuff when you're learning. Mm-hmm. You think about, like, you have to kind of run out and run into some problems and then get help. And you run out and you run into some problems and you get help. Like, it's almost like you can't get to the end state unless you slam into the wall repeatedly, if that makes sense.
Well, it's
like, I would be a crap mentor if I told you the final answer because you wouldn't understand why it was important.
Well, there's that, and it's also something where, like we said earlier, there are uses for CRUD.
Yes.
And it's more simple apps. It's a great thing to learn early on.
And it's a good thing to put junior devs on.
Right. And that's where I started, was doing a lot of CRUD apps. I've grown to where I'm doing more than CRUD apps. I get to do some of the microservices. I get to do some of the other things. But I've also gotten to bring things in because once I got the CRUD apps down, I was able to do my job and learn.
It's almost like the interaction of your app with a database is the Zen koan of computer science. Mm-hmm. Koan, Koan, not Cohen.
Yeah.
Right? Because there is like Zen koan? I don't know him.
Yeah.
No, but it's like, it's a thing that it reflects your journey in a lot of ways because like a lot of your older developers really trend a lot more towards CRUD style apps because that's kind of what we did and that's kind of what we discovered. And the database was a more reliable way to get data, metadata out to the app.
Right.
For how things were structured versus having to code it ourselves because the languages were cumbersome. Mm-hmm. And so you can almost see like a marked change in the way the developers through the years have looked at this.
Exactly. I definitely want to say that CRUD in and of itself isn't bad. As you guys can see, most of the problems that we listed are process related. There were a few technical problems in our list, but they're more about misuse of CRUD than anything else.
Yeah, because tools are not bad.
Right.
It's the use of tools that gets you in trouble.
Exactly. CRUD is a way of conceptualizing the relationship of how data is stored and transferred. There are other ways to do this, which we plan to address in future shows. That pretty much wraps us up. Before we close everything out, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, I was on the, I think it was the general Slack chat. It was one of our Slacks for, the Complete Developer Network. And I was trying to express to some of the developers on there something, and I had a hard time with it. It's a mindset thing. And it's that when you're writing code or you're building processes for people, right? Human beings are messy. Like George Carlin said, imagine how dumb the dumbest person is and realize half of them are dumber than that. Now here's the other part that he didn't say is all of us are in that dumb half at least part of the time, right? Like on any given thing, we're stupid probably at least half of the time. And so when you're trying to build systems, you try to avoid like the obvious, hey, this is a catastrophic failure. This is easy to prevent. You fix those things, but you can't fix all the things that can go wrong. And so you have to start thinking about optimizing the balance between preventing problems and being resilient to problems. In other words, it's like sparring. Like you figure out, okay, how can I work on my footwork and my blocks and my ability to dodge and my agility and, all that kind of stuff so that I don't get hit. But you also have to learn to take a punch because you will get hit. And so when you're constructing apps, you kind of have to think about it in those sort of terms. It's a cross between completely preventing injury and being able to sustain an injury and keep moving. So sometimes you don't want to build a fix into your app. Sometimes you go, okay, instead of trying to prevent this really difficult to prevent problem because, it's hard to do code wise, or, somebody, like you have an app that says, okay, well, we really don't like cat pictures here. Like, the people here, really like, I don't know, Egyptian mythology and the cats are the guardians of the dead. And you want to keep that out, right? And they're uploading pictures. Well, you can't do that easily programmatically.
It's kind of like that.
Like that's a Google research project.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's like that, was it XKCD that it had like one comic was, hey, I want you to allow people to upload pictures and say where they're from. It's like, oh, well, that's simple. Just need to get the geolocation off the pictures. Give me an hour and I'll do that. And he says, and then I want you to tell if it's a bird or a plane or a cloud. And she's like, all right, I'm going to need a research team, 5 years, thousands and thousands of dollars.
Millions.
Millions. Yeah. All this stuff. And yeah. So like, I get you.
Yeah. So what happens here? Well, you say, okay, I can't look at that image. Now, machine learning is coming along. So, like this particular Tricks of the Trade may not age as well as we would like. But right now, it's a lot more effort to determine what this is a picture of. So what do? Okay, well, they're offended by cats. So when someone uploads a cat, you give them the ability to delete that thing. You don't go, hey, we're going to try to detect it. We're going to try to prevent it. You just go, yeah, let's just make it where they can clean it up and go on with life. Knowing the balance between those things is what makes a good developer.
Well, it's like Facebook has the ability, they may not, they try to filter their ads to the best of their ability.
Yeah.
But then they also have people can report the ads. You can say you don't want to see ads from this place anymore. You can hide them. Things like that.
Yeah, and that's just a more intelligent way to look at things. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't prevent everything. It's hubris to think you can. Mm-hmm. But what you can do is you can make it where it can be fixed after the fact. And that's just a smarter way to go. So that's all I got.
Stand by for Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed through Creative Commons. The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up for weekly emails with extra tips and insights, be sure to check out the website at completedeveloperpodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with news about the show. Look for us each week on Facebook Live before we record each episode. Thanks for listening. See you next time.